I am constantly longing for discovering new things and ways of doing design and architecture. There's a certain restlessness about my life and my character. So I'm not really confined to a specific style or formal language. With every project, I seek to open a new palette of tools and colors with which then I can challenge the task and myself and trying to avoid the repetitive. Hi, I am Alexis Dornier. I do architecture and design. We're at my house, Lebar, in Uluwatu, Bali. Lebar is the Indonesian word for wide or expansive, which applies to the core idea of the house. It frames the landscape rather than becoming a gesture in the landscape. So just like a Polaroid picture or a landscape picture, the floors and ceilings encapsulate the vicinity of the site and its beautiful landscape. I got first introduced by the idea of architecture by watching movies, and I was intrigued by how architecture can be the backdrop of scenes and stories taking place. So a lot of the architecture that I have been doing and that I'm fascinated doing is to create the memorable background of these stories and for people to enjoy and experience life. I take a lot of inspiration from this house from early child memories. For example, my grandfather's house by a lake in the south of Germany. It was a very simple home that sort of expanded out onto the lake, onto the nearby lake, and a lot of grassy fields around it. So I enjoyed sort of reminding myself of that when designing this home. The landscape of Uluwatu specific is very special and memorable because it's sort of semi-arid and tropical, and there's a beautiful mix, which reminds me also of the time that I spent in California in my early teens. And the relationship of a building to the ocean is something that reminds me a lot of sort of the back hills of Santa Barbara. And with that comes the full nostalgia of mid-century modern architecture, which I simply love. And then through that, you develop a certain nostalgia about the citations of mid-century modern architecture and its simplicity and its experimentation of large open glass surfaces that reflect nature or the surrounding. And the idea of reflection just strongly integrates with the architectural design. Also for this house in specific, I just loved these large open glass planes that this open plan house is circumferred by. And we have these large wraparound balconies that extend the floor plane of the living room into the garden and the surrounding landscape. When I do compassionate self-inquiry or asking myself why I love certain things, I get surprised by the fact that probably 90% of that is all related back to childhood. I have an approach that I'd like to reshuffle my cards every time and not be confined by how I think things should work like. So a great deal of work gets put into just freeing or trying to free my mind from how I have done things in the project before, so I can just start fresh and be free of my own paradigms. It becomes for certain people especially challenging to design for themselves, because you can no longer pass on responsibility for your decisions to the constraints and variables of the project alone. You're very much confronted with, a limitless number of options and possibilities. So a lot of reflection has to take place of what you actually like. And as there's so much storytelling in architectural design for me, usually, I'm spending a great deal of time formulating the narrative, and then this is something I move along and see every item should fit into the story. For this one, I deliberately tried to free myself from that story and said, I just simply want to choose objects that I love and that I necessarily need to fit into a greater story. This house is a very personal expression of who I was, why I designed it. And of course, as I evolve and get inspired by new things every day, a house ideally can keep living and can be reshaped through its interior objects or pieces of art or the change of the landscape. I find the idea of a static finished product sort of less realistic. I think architecture can be a container or a framework that allows for change, that allows for evolution, and nothing's obviously static. The floor is called Ujung Pandang, which is actually the name of a place. It's sort of the Indonesian version of the travertine. I love, light fixtures in general, and I depict them as the jewelry of the house. So quite literally, I have a bar and a ring as a symbol of the jewelry of the house in an abstract way. There's a certain fascination for playing with scale. By putting large objects into a space, something happens. The mind gets tricked, if you will. It's something that I enjoy looking at every day. And as the day progresses and the light changes, the house really becomes alive at night. When I look at every object that I find interesting or otherwise objects that surround me, I see and feel the energy that someone has put into creating this. I feel that energy by looking at this. Is it still alive all these hours? You can see buzzing, and that's really fascinating for me. When I feel the dedication and the love, commitment, and passion that somebody has put into whatever they loved doing and created, that's something that inspires me deeply.
For more insightful videos on design, subscribe to Design Will Save the World.